you can hear me. This is the first time I've tried this setup to make a video. So usually I take videos of other people or take pictures. So let's see how this works. I'm so glad you've asked about the radium dial case and my father's involvement. It's been very exciting in the last 10 years or so since the first time I saw the wonderful play These Shining Lives by Melanie Marnick, which was successfully produced here at Rivendell Theater in Chicago, and I've seen many times in different parts of the country by college students, professional students. That began a new interest in the Radium Dial Girls case, particularly in the Illinois case. There is since then another play about the New Jersey case, which is good and is often used in high schools because it has more parts. But it's not. It's the case that's really the first part of the wonderful, wonderful book that I think you've all read, Kate Moore's The Radium Girls. Kate, this is the British version of the book. I like it because it's got a little more about my mother in it. The American publisher wanted to tighten it up, so it doesn't have quite as much of that, but the basic story is still in the one you can get on Amazon. Oops. So, many of your questions people have asked before, so I'm trying to think, and I don't know how to answer them because I wasn't born yet when the case took place, and my father died when I was in 7th grade, almost out of 7th grade. So I would love to have been able to ask him many of the same questions you're asking me, but I've thought about a lot of them, and I hope I can come up with some answers. One of the common questions that I'm asked, two-part question really, is how come my father took the case, and why didn't he charge a fee? Well, he took the case for a couple of reasons. I've learned over the years that Clarence Darrow, the famous attorney who you may have heard of from the monkey trial, the trial over against the teacher who was teaching evolution in Tennessee. That was Clarence Darrow, and the girls had written Clarence Darrow to see if he would represent them after they lost their first attorney. And he was around 80 years old and not well, and from what I understand, he referred the case to my father. And Darrow was one of my father's heroes, and he was actually one of the very few heroes I ever had growing up. He very often represented the underdog. He fought very difficult cases, and I kind of think of my father as a mini Clarence Darrow in some ways. Now, Darrow represented some reprehensible clients, and in other parts of my father's legal career, I would love to ask him about why he represented certain defendants and why he associated with certain political groups that were running in the city of Chicago. So many questions I can't answer, but I'm sure that if you get a request from Clarence Darrow, it's very hard to turn down. And this case, frankly, came at a time when my father's life was not that easy. He had been involved in politics in Chicago, and business was down at that point. The exciting thing when this case began is that he had just married my mother a few months earlier, and that was one of the highlights of his life, and she helped him on the case. Why didn't he charge? Well, there was really no one to charge. In many cases, if you win a judgment, you can get a percentage of the award, but the likely award here was very small, and there was really nothing to distribute. But the case was important. He represented many, many clients who couldn't pay him, or they paid him they bartered more or less. I remember he took black shoes instead of a fee from a guy who had a shoe store, and that was wonderful. And I had shoes from 6th grade till I was in high school, but boys didn't want to wear black dress shoes in those days, but I had a whole set of perfectly good black dress shoes in the sizes that I was wearing. So that's what I what I got. My father accepted the fee. I understood he took some underwater property, or some property that, or didn't take some property that turned out to be underwater in Florida. It's too bad he didn't take it, because eventually it was drained, and I think there was some money there, but he didn't. And he died young. I say young because was 9 years younger than I am today. Now, so the community, why was the community struggled with these girls? They didn't know what to do. This was very depressing. First of all, women didn't speak out yet. This wasn't that long after the suffragette, the vote was won, maybe 19 years. And so it was, so my father decided to take the case in spite of community opposition. Now he had, as I mentioned, he was sometimes in the political outs in Chicago, but that never stopped him. He always stood up for what he believed in, and he took cases representing clients, and many lawyers, that was not a Freudian slip, many lawyers, was it the slip? Many lawyers take cases of clients that they disagree with, but they represent. But here, he had clients who were really, really worthy of representation, and you sometimes have to stand up to a community. Darrow did that many times. He did it in other cases. He had cases from workers in Chicago's stockyards who worked in freezers and whose hands froze. He represented a swami, a fake yogi, who people were angry at, and he managed to save his life by getting him to agree to a short prison sentence. So rather than be sued and lose everything he had. So trial work is complicated. And these girls really had a really tragic story that he felt needed to be heard. Now, what strategies did he use? Well, among the other strategies he used, and this is something that Darrow did as well, was publicity. Get not just the local public, but the world, the larger public, aroused on your side. And so while the town of Ottawa in those days was very hostile, the broader world gave it a lot of attention. And I have newspaper clippings, as you've seen if you've looked at my website, from all over the world. The same story repeated, the same pictures repeated from all over the world about the case. So he generated publicity. He worked very, very hard. I was young then, and I didn't understand it. I mean, even in the years he was alive. But when I became a lawyer later, and there I am in a trial in federal court. That's me with the full head of hair back there on this side of the picture. When I was first trying cases, sometimes it's very hard. You take the cases that come to you. What strategies did he use? That's what we were talking about. So but he, as I started to say, he was working very hard. He was meticulous. When I read his briefs, and I've sent you a few pages of them, I was astounded at the amount of work he had, the research he had done. And that was in the days before the internet, before any online sources, the days when you had to go out, you had to go to the library, do not only the research in the law, which was changing. One of the issues was that up until just before this case went to court, poison was not covered under the workers' compensation law. So the company argued that this was a poison and wasn't covered. Then the law flipped. They decided, the state legislature decided to cover poison. So now they were arguing that it wasn't a poison. So you have to be up on the law, do the research, painstaking research, both in law and facts. So these are some of the things that were challenging to him. One of the challenges that was very difficult was the fact that it was now many, many years. Many of these girls worked in the mid-1920s in the plant, in the late 1920s. And now it's in the mid-1930s to the late 1930s. And the law didn't allow you to go back that far. And one of the principles that he established was that you can't measure the time within which you're allowed to bring a case until the victim is aware that they're sick. And the nature of radium poisoning is that it takes many years to become effective. And then that's one of the things. The company kept giving them physical exams, and until they were too sick to work, the company kept telling them, "You're perfectly fine." So for years that went on, and then the company fired them and didn't tell them why. They knew they were sick. They knew they couldn't keep up, but the company didn't tell them that you're sick from radium poisoning. Now, and you know, the women, the young women, they're called the radium girls today. We would call them the radium women. They participated, one, by supporting Catherine Donahue as the private client. Two, they testified as witnesses. And they were very helpful in that way. The radium case did have a broader impact. It didn't have an immediate effect on the law, but its publicity began to spread out. And oddly enough, Illinois was a leader in workers' compensation. It had one of the first, if not the first, workers' compensation law in the country, way back, I think, around 1913. And it kept evolving. It's only in recent years that Illinois and some other states are trying to cut back on their workers' compensation law and the claim that it costs jobs because employers have to pay for it. That's forgetting that employers who, if an injury is covered by workers' comp, the employee can't sue privately where the damages might have been much greater. Did they expect, some people ask, did they expect the case to lead to federal regulations and agencies dedicated to worker safety and radium regulations? I don't know that they expected that directly, and it was many, many years before the federal OSHA Act, Occupational Safe and Health Administration, was passed. That was under Richard Nixon in the 1970s. So so it was a long battle, and the battles have to be continually won. As a I worked for 30 years for the U.S. Department of Labor as an attorney, many times mostly in workers' right, mostly in payroll matters, minimum wage, overtime, migrant labor, where I had to fight employers who were cheating their employees out of the pennies that they were getting at the minimum wage. When I started, I think it was $2.35 an hour, the federal minimum wage. Hard to believe now. And it's only, I think, still under $8, the actual federal minimum wage. And tipped employees get only about a third of that. Waiters and busboys and so forth. Later, I didn't want to originally, but I was assigned to do OSHA cases. These are cases involving industrial accident and safety, and I'm so glad I did, because I gained a real appreciation of the kind of work my father did, the difficulty of proving these cases, and the employers take the same arguments today that Radium Dial did then. We would never harm our workers, they say. They say that the conditions in the plants are safe, that the materials they use are not poisonous or harmful, or that the trenches they're digging are properly shored up, when it's not the case. And even nail polish salons, the chemicals used can be toxic. And I know a few years ago there were battles in New York State over that. And these kinds of battles continue for decades. So the battles are still to be won. Somebody wondered whether my father was ever nervous because he was fighting the current legislation. Well, a lawyer who isn't nervous when he goes into court or tense, it's a little bit like stage fright. You need that tension to be able to do your best work. I don't think he was nervous because he was going against legislation. But there is a tension that you need in order to perform. When he wrote the final brief, the one I sent you a few pages from, it was the largest brief of its kind ever filed. It's either that one or one of the others. The largest brief ever filed in the Illinois Industrial Commission up to that point. He worked around the clock for a week with 3 secretaries on 8-hour shifts. taking dictation from him and then typing it. And then he collapsed, and my mother got on the train and took the brief to Springfield. My mother also played a role in that she had come over just from Germany in 1934, and so she spoke and read German, and a lot of the medical literature was in German. So although she didn't have any medical knowledge, she was able to translate documents that showed that the medical literature was out there already, establishing that radium was a poison and that radium was dangerous. Had he dealt with, he had been, as I said, a workers' comp lawyer, that is workers' compensation, so he had dealt with many different kinds of industrial injuries, automobile accidents. In fact, the main toys I grew up with as a boy back in the 1940s was, we had 3 rubber cars that looked like 1930s cars. One was red rubber, one was green rubber, and one was white rubber, and he used those for have his clients in car cases show him accidents, how the accident went. And so I got to play with him. But I don't think he ever had a case, and I'm sure he never had a case involving radium poisoning, although he did have cases involving medical conditions that arose out of work before. But radium poisoning was not that well known. It was, and the federal government to this day is fighting new legislation regarding beryllium and other chemicals involved in uranium mining and in the munitions industry. And the government still is delaying on tactics for developing legislation and rules to cover those harms. So it's not over. Now, why don't more people know about the Radium Girls in this case? Well, first of all, the town of Ottawa didn't want anybody to know. There was a movie 30 years ago called Radium City, and you can get it on YouTube, which told the story and even told the after story, which is that when this plant closed down, the company opened up across town in another facility and started the business all over again, although maybe they didn't use lip pointing as much. That's where the girls didn't put the brushes in their mouth so much, but they still used the same techniques. And when those plants were torn down, the materials went into landfill, and all over Ottawa, there are still places where when the EPA goes in with Geiger counters and other testing equipment, it's a high level of radioactivity. So the town wasn't interested in letting the world know. You know, there's things that become popular and interesting even in our 24-hour news cycle, but in those days it was a longer cycle, but things are headlines, and these were, as you saw from the newspapers, and there's some, well, they're behind me on the wall here, some headlines. You can't see them. Things become important for a few days, and then there's something else that comes into your attention. So this is the late 1930s. A few years later, we were in World War II. Attention goes to munitions and development, and plants that are preparing for the war. And so attention spans fade, just like we have things in the news today that seem horrible to us. And in a few weeks, we'll be on to something else. Now, with the Radium, the play, These Shining Lives 10 years ago, which is now being, as I mentioned, produced in high schools and junior community colleges and even bigger schools, and in Park District playhouses and professional playhouses all over the world, more and more people began to learn about the case. And in fact, there was a musical, one version of, oh, you can't see it, one version of the play, they took These Shining Lives and made it into a musical. I had to go see it because I never heard my father sing. I used to joke, and then I went and I discovered that he didn't have a singing part in that either. But I think this play was better without the music. And then, but that began to get a lot of publicity. And Kate Moore in London produced the play. And in her research, she got so interested in the story of the play that she decided to learn both about the Illinois case in Ottawa and about the cases in the East. And she came over here and did a lot of research. I was thrilled to meet her and be able to take her over to Northwestern Library to have access to some materials there and to go over the original scrapbooks. And she wrote the amazing book that you've got, which is the best resource I've found. There are a lot of books out there that touch on it. There's one called Radium Girls, not The Radium Girls, And that's got some basic information. In fact, that's where I read first that my father was referred the case by Clarence Darrow. But this is the first book that I've seen that covers both the New Jersey cases and the Illinois case, and talks about the legal and medical information, and gets into the story of the girls and really gets to tell their story. And since that book has come out, I am constantly running into people who have read that book. We were at the theater last night, and a friend of my wife's was there, and he came back. He said, I'm just reading the Radium Girls, and I didn't realize that that was your husband's father. I didn't know anything about this, but everybody said we have to read the book. So the case was in scientific circles known. I was in Israel 15, 20 years ago, and before the plays and everything, and I ran into somebody, a scientist who had studied it when he was in school. But it's just beginning to become well known, and Radium Girls was a Goodreads bestseller by the members of Goodreads. It's been an Amazon bestseller in its category, and The Radium Girls. And be careful, because there's Radium Girls, the book, and The Radium Girls, and Kate Moore's excellent book is The Radium Girls. So I hope that some of what I've told you has been helpful, and ignore the rest. And if you have any other questions, please email. So thank you again for your interest, and I look forward to hearing from you.